going to completely level with you that I had no idea how to compete with a clown on stilts, and walkout music seemed appropriate. So for those of you that like Triple H, there's a little nod there. Firstly, thank you for having me here. This is my first conference talk south of the equator. It is an absolute pleasure to be at such an awesome venue with this many people, so thank you for showing up today. My name is Calum Hall. I am the co-founder of Phorion, a macOS endpoint detection response product. I am a macOS security researcher at heart. I work in the kind of blue team world now, but my heart really lies in the kind of offensive security side of things. My whole career has kind of been focusing on macOS enterprise security and how we can attack and defend macOS enterprise estates. I've been able to present some of that research at some awesome conferences, BlackHat, Objective by the Sea, and obviously now at Kawaiicon. So again, thank you for having me. So on the agenda today, we're going to be talking about macOS ransomware and how it kind of works in that ecosystem, the macOS ecosystem. We're going to look through the kind of state of macOS malware today, so where we've come from, where we are, and potentially where we're going. We're going to look into some macOS ransomware itself on the platform. We're then going to talk through detecting some ransomware for the blue teamers in the room. A slight sidetrack into Apple's Time Machine, which is their backup solution for those of you that are familiar with Apple. We're going to talk about some damage mitigation. So none of us want to get ransomwared. How can we stop it and at least mitigate some of the damage? Last but not least, we will, of course, demo it. And rumor has it, 3 or 4 days ago, I found some more content, and there's potentially some bonus content if we have time at the end. So to kick us off, the state of macOS malware today. When I got into macOS security, everything was adware. It was adware called Schlayer that was coming in Adobe Flash Player packages. It was the same thing kind of rinsed and repeat for quite a number of years. Now, this wasn't to be scoffed at. For individuals, it was a high risk. But for enterprises, not so much. All right? macOS's, when I got into the industry, were still seen as like very individual devices and not so much kind of corporate devices. Now, fast forward to kind of 2023, when we really started to see macOS endpoints and macOS estates within kind of corporate environments ramp up. We started seeing a lot of info stealers coming out. Now, info stealers obviously aren't great for individuals, losing crypto wallets, credit cards, your browser sessions, but far more from an enterprise perspective, info stealers became an entry point into your environment, and they were pretty bad news, and to this day are the most common macOS malware that we see out there. Now, thankfully, info stealers are pretty easy to detect. The reality is, regardless what their TTPs are, they go after the same things every single time. They go after crypto wallets, they go after cookies. They're fairly predictable in their objectives, and if you have the right tooling, you can kind of stop them in their tracks. Now, the point of today's talk, though, is talking about macOS ransomware. So first thing I just want to call out is I don't want to be that guy that goes on stage and tells everyone the sky is falling and that ransomware is hitting every macOS estate. The reality is macOS ransomware is a little bit of a simmering volcano. Like, we have never really seen it at an enterprise scale. There have been kind of very few, if any, enterprise-reported breaches from ransomware. But there have been multiple scares across the year, and multiple times where researchers such as myself have seen samples come out thinking, this is it, it's about to kick off. What I believe, though, and why I think it's important to talk about this today, is to kind of get ahead of the problem. If we look at ransomware over the years, it's only going in one direction. It's becoming more and more prevalent. And 5 years ago, it was focusing on Windows environments. Today, we're seeing it across hybrid environments. So users move into the cloud, data moves into the cloud, attackers go where the users are. Right? That's the kind of one thing we understand about threat actors. And because of that, we can kind of deduct that if we are seeing a continuous increase in macOS endpoints within the corporate environment, we should be able to come to the at least reasoning that we should have some protections for ransomware on macOS in the event it does become the next big thing. Especially from a macOS adoption perspective, I'm not sure if anyone saw this, but Cisco came out a few months back saying that they're now seeing 60% of their employees are choosing Macs. So when you're seeing enterprise adoption at scale, even at companies like enterprise macOS adoption at scale, even at companies like Cisco, it kind of gives us an indicator as to where things are going. So diving into some macOS ransomware samples, the first one I'm going to talk about was discovered by Dinesh Davidos in June 2020. It is macOS ransomware with some decent capabilities. For those of you that like reverse engineering in the room, it is an absolute pain to run on a virtual machine. It persists in multiple different ways. It runs like 3 different binaries that all randomly encrypt different files, and it is very frustrating to work with. But by and large, those of us that are familiar with the Windows ransomware, it has a lot of very similar kind of capabilities. It really focuses on data theft and exfiltration. So when you execute it, it grabs your notes, it grabs your cookies, lots of different kind of info stealer behaviors, and it then goes to encrypt the file system. Now, it targets specific file types, which I think is fairly common as well. So it goes after your documents, your personal documents, your cryptocurrency wallets, and things that you're actually going to care about rather than just your random 20 gig virtual machines. So as with any ransomware, it drops the standard kind of README ransom note demanding payment. Now, I'm going to play the dangerous game of asking for a little bit of audience participation. Does anyone want to guess how much we think the ransom is? $100? 50 bitcoins? Million? Okay, so we've got a fair range. This absolutely cracked me up. It is a whopping $50. So I think it's safe to say that this was never targeted for the enterprise. This was very much, let's mess up some people's laptops, get them to pay us $50 and see where we go from there. Moving on, we have what is termed as knock lockbit. This was discovered back in, or at the end of May 2020, or sorry, end of 2024. I believe it was October time. This was ransomware that had macOS capabilities that claimed to be lockbit. Most security research that reverse engineered this malware came to the conclusion that this was highly unlikely to be the actual lockbit developers. There were a number of key factors. The first one being the version was off. The version of lockbit at that time was 3.0, whereas the version claimed to be 2.0. The core lockbit developers had been apprehended earlier that year, so it's highly unlikely that they're sitting in a prison cell writing ransomware. You never know. But the affiliation is great for fear-mongering. So if you're wanting people to actually take you seriously and have the fear that you're really going to mess up their environment, pretending to be one of the most prevalent ransomware groups in the world is a pretty strong way of doing it. Interestingly, initial research from Trend Micro indicates that the Windows variant targets shadow backups. This is super common in the Windows world. Destroying backups means people can't kind of recover their data easily, but there was no kind of replicated capability on the macOS sample of the malware. This is my worst looking slide, and you'll see that's because it came out 2 days ago. In November 5th, 2025, I did promise you it was my worst slide. Secure Annex released a blog post titled Ransom Vibing Appears in VS Code Extensions. Now, firstly, ransom vibing is hilarious. Secondly, the image is absolutely fantastic. But this was on the VS Code extension marketplace. Now, the description was something along the lines of archives, encrypts, and exfiltrates data. It claimed to be on both macOS and Windows, but it was very targeted towards like a /temp/testing directory. So I think it's important as researchers that we don't just bubble things up because it makes us sound cooler and makes things more interesting. It's very possible that this is just someone's university project that they've put out there. It's a little bit too soon to say, like, yeah, this is malware that a threat actor's pushing out. But nonetheless, it shows that at the very least people were ransom vibing malware at this point in time. So from a blue team perspective, how do we go around detecting malware, ransomware? So we're going to kind of take 3 pillars of the detection strategy here in the order that we're going to discuss them. So First and foremost, if you're running an enterprise macOS estate, you'll have presumably some kind of telemetry gathering solution, which will allow you to monitor file modification at scale. So you see X process wrote 100 files within a 2-second period. It's probably not super rare. I mean, a lot of processes, if you clone a Git repository, if you download a package, it's fairly common behavior, but we can then move on to the next step, which is evaluating the process that performed that activity. On macOS, there is the concept of signing, so you get signed and unsigned binaries, which, whilst not always perfect, Apple makes mistakes, gives you a certain level of confidence if something is probably not malware versus an unsigned binary is highly suspicious. There's a few other things we can look at, things like binary create times, where it came from, that kind of thing. And last but not least is file encryption. So once we've made it past those first 2 steps, and we've seen this untrusted, suspicious process created these 100 files within a second, let's go and look at those files, and let's see, is it just writing legitimate data, or is the data that it's writing suspicious? That takes us on to the kind of deeper side of this. The detection strategy we're going to be employing here, I will not take credit for a lot of this. Patrick Wardle wrote a fantastic blog post years ago called Towards Generic Ransomware Detection. This was years back, and it still does a fantastic job of detecting ransomware. One of the main challenges with ransomware is being able to identify encryption with confidence. Thankfully, there's a couple of ways that we can do this. The first being entropy analysis. So we effectively want to look at a file, evaluate the randomness of the bytes within that file, and attempt to make a decision of, is this encrypted/compressed, or is this a plain text file? Now, that takes us on to the next part of the challenge, which is encryption versus compression. Now, those two look fairly similar. We can, thankfully, however, though, use some well-known mathematical tests to tell encrypted data from compressed data. Now, this isn't a perfect art, but we can use what's called the Monte Carlo integration and the chi-squared test. Now, if you're anything like myself, and I'm absolutely terrible at math, I would highly recommend that you go and chuck it into ChatGPT and ask it to explain as if you were a small child. That is how I got my general understanding at first, before diving into the technical part of that, which we won't be covering. So I will save you all of that before lunch. So some detection challenges, though. When you want to perform entropy analysis and try and get an understanding of whether something is encrypted or not encrypted, the file needs to be of a reasonable size. So if you have a 100-byte file, it's probably not a large enough size to be confident enough to say, yes, that's encrypted, or no, it's not encrypted. Developers do weird stuff. When I talk about untrusted processes and unsigned binaries, what have you, there's no such thing as a silver bullet in security because developers do crazy things. For those of you that have ever worked in Blue Team, and Google Updater is the perfect example of this. It runs a crazy amount of stuff and looks highly suspicious, but it's just part of their legitimate update process. Now, for what we are looking to do, which is stop ransomware, confidence is absolutely essential with what we're doing. If you as a blue teamer are going to take immediate response to something and automate something like killing processes or isolating binaries, you can't be 50-50 on whether it's malicious or not. You really need to increase the kind of true positive rate on that. Now, how we achieve that is sample size. So the greater the sample size, the more files you wait to say, okay, 100 files have been encrypted, I am now pretty confident, or 200 files, whatever it may be. The longer you can wait, the less likely you are to make a mistake. This, however, for me is a huge problem with detecting ransomware, because if it takes you 50 files in to detect the ransomware is there, by the time you've responded, you might have just lost your most valuable 50 files. And if you ever go and run any of the samples, the files that they encrypt are completely random. They don't go through in any normal process. They pick random files at a time. So it's a little bit of a gamble if you're waiting for 50 files to be encrypted before taking any action. Which leads us into a kind of sidetrack of this talk. So we're going to talk about Time Machine a little bit, and I promise you my advice here isn't to ship hard drives to all of your developers and tell them to start doing backups every day. Time Machine is Apple's backup solution that was released in 2007. It was released, if you care to get some more information on the kind of history of Time Machine, Howard Oakley wrote a fantastic blog post called A Brief History of Time Machine. It's one of the best technical reads I've ever had. Now, one of the cool things about Time Machine is it uses local snapshots. For those of you that come from the Windows world, these are fairly similar to Windows volume shadow copies. We'll talk about those a little bit more in a second, but the crucial part is that Time Machine is very clever with storage. It doesn't just take an exact copy of your file system and then copy and paste it, so you've now got twice the amount of data on your disk. It is far more clever with how it stores. So speaking of which, Apple file system snapshots, they capture a point-in-time state of the file system. The way that it works is Time Machine effectively freezes your system, marks your original data blocks as read-only, and from that point onwards, if you go and change a file on your disk, instead of writing it to the original data location, it writes it to a new location in disk, which means your local time shots are all at freeze of the data at that point in time. These every hour, and these local snapshots. It takes them before major OS events like updates and before full backups to make sure the snapshot is up to date. Snapshots typically last for a 24-hour period. I say typically, Apple randomly orphans them every now and then, but by and large, it does a fairly good job cleaning up. Snapshots live on the APFS data volume, and they are not mounted to the disk until Time Machine needs them. However, when Time Machine needs them, it mounts them to volumes/com Apple Time Machine, local snapshots. You can go in there and you can browse those files if you like, or you can manually mount them. So you can specify a directory and say, mount this APFS snapshot here. I want to read the files. Caveat, you do need full disk access to do that. However, on macOS environments, so many people give their applications and their terminals full disk access that that's a pretty low bar. So tying this all together a little bit and how this all makes sense in the conversation of ransomware, where I got to is, well, what if we can use local snapshots to recover those 50 files that were encrypted prior to our detection point? So detecting ransomware and killing it is fantastic, but what if we could remediate any effect it ever had, rather than just surrendering those first 50 files? So the one thing I really want to caveat with this is a technique that I'm explaining. I'm going to show it with my product in a minute, but this is something that you should go away and build however you want. I'm not a fan of people plugging products at conferences, so follow the techniques here. I will just be showing it working within our environment. So we effectively want to take periodic local snapshots. So set up something in your devices that takes local snapshots every 2 hours, for example. We then want to implement some kind of detection based on the detection strategy we talked about before. Once the ransomware is detected, we want to immediately kill it to stop as few encryption technique or files being encrypted as possible. We then want to look at that telemetry that we have gathered and see, okay, prior to the point of killing the ransomware, what files were encrypted? Like, what did the ransomware hit before we were able to stop it? We're going to track those files, put it off to the side for a second. We are going to mount the local Time Machine snapshot that we have taken a maximum of 2 hours earlier. 2 hours if you're being very unlucky, but effectively the latest snapshot that your device has taken. We want to manually mount them. It's essential to note here that those snapshots are read-only. So it's not like if you mount them and you failed to kill the ransomware that it's going to go encrypt that data. That data can't be written to, which is essential. And last but not least, what we're going to want to do is to copy every single file that we saw was modified. We want to delete any new files that were created, rename any files that were renamed, and recover everything back to the original state of where it was before the ransomware was run. So, quick demo of this. I'll try and walk through it. I think I'm doing okay for time, so we'll see how we go. So on our left here, I'm going to run some test ransomware that is targeted at one of my directories. I would not recommend going and testing ransomware on your host, so this is something a little bit easier to develop against. So we're going to run some test ransomware. You'll see our files in the right there. It's about the process was then killed as we detected the ransomware. And on the right, about half of the files have been encrypted and half of them are fine. And that is down to the detection point killing it before it got to all of the files. So we're going to jump in. You'll see an alert come through. All I'm trying to do here is visualize the amount of files that were encrypted prior to us being able to get in there and stop the ransomware. So you can see we've detected the ransomware activity. You can see the responsible binary. And then there's going to be a lot of scrolling here as you see all of these kind of file create and file rename events. So you can see the underlying process that's responsible for this. This is crucial if you're actually wanting to go and grab the binary after. But crucially, we want to recover those files. So what we're going to do now is we're going to kick off an action, which is going to mount Time Machine and start deleting the files, encrypted files that are created and restoring all of the original files back to where Rick Astley was before. Sweet. Cool. So as you can see, we have all of our data back, and effectively the ransomware, yes, it ran, yes, it encrypted files, but we're exactly where we were a maximum of 2 hours ago. So we're kind of nullifying the effect there of ransomware. Now, the kind of takeaways from this portion of the talk, prepare for ransomware. Don't wait. Like, this is something I think the security industry can be better at, is don't wait for something to become a problem to then get ahead of it. We have seen ransomware destroying organizations in the Windows world for years. We've now seen it in the cloud. Is it inevitable it's going to end up in macOS space? Potentially not, but it is highly likely if we look at how threat actors operate. So prepare for it now. You're better to have these capabilities and not need them than to need them and not have them. In terms of detection capabilities, go and evaluate if you have the capability to detect this now. If you don't have the capability, identify if it is a telemetry gap, if it is a tooling gap, whatever it may be. macOS and the enterprise is now kind of here to stay. It shouldn't be treated as a second-class citizen. There are so many tools out there that will detect macOS on Windows, ransomware on Windows, but very few that will, if any, that will do it on macOS. The last but not least, the easy thing you can go and do here is to automate snapshots. Even if you have to go and build some custom tooling to do this, there are inbuilt Apple commands that you can use to run snapshots, as we'll see in a second. Going and running those every couple of hours means that on your users' devices, you always have a safe copy of the files in case anything like this were to happen. Crucially, though, you must protect these snapshots, as we will see in a moment. I am a firm believer as a security researcher, if you do any defensive content or release any new research, you always need to think of the offensive side of things, because the second you release it, it's exactly what every threat actor is going to do. And in this case, we have a nice little file access auth bypass. So in the same way that as defenders, we can mount local snapshots to gain access to the files that we want to recover, an attacker can do the exact same thing to bypass things like file access controls on the devices. So if anyone here is running a macOS Enterprise estate, one of the best things that you can do is implement some sort of file access controls to block access to things like cookies, keychains, crypto wallets, that kind of thing. But nothing is ever a silver bullet in security. We have a demo here where I'm going to show what happens if you create a local snapshot, mount that snapshot, and we'll see where we go from there. Cool. So here I'm going to attempt to read my Chrome cookies database, if you can all see that on the screen. You'll see I get an authorization denied. I have file access controls in place. I am going to create a snapshot of the device using tmutil, which is the Time Machine utility. You'll see how quickly that took place. I am now going to take the timestamp from that snapshot I've just taken, and I am going to mount the snapshot from the data drive. Now, again, takes no time at all. I have now mounted that to a temporary directory, and if I change the file path that I am reading to be from within the local Time Machine snapshot and not directly from the user's cookie location on disk, you'll see we gain access to the device's cookies. Sweet. Cool. So some countermeasures there. First and foremost, if you're a blue teamer in the room, go and do some hunting to understand what within your environment has full disk access, especially terminals and things like that. Some developers may need it, most people don't. Some detections you can go and build. Monitor usage of TMUtil, which is Time Machines Utility. Make sure that people aren't manually creating snapshots. More importantly, find some way of blocking people deleting snapshots. I think that is a crucial element of what we need to do here as well. We can monitor for things like manual APFS mounts. If someone is manually mounting those snapshots, it's highly unlikely that's for legitimate usage. And broader file access authorization rules. So if you implement some kind of protections for your cookies, never just assume that they are going to be in /users in your kind of standard directory and your standard volume. If you can broaden those without the performance impact to be far more generic and far more generic paths, like the one we can see on screen, you have a far greater chance of being protected against this stuff. Cool, so that is a wrap for myself. Please reach out to me on Twitter if you have any questions. If you run a blue team, especially if you're using any tools to protect your cookies, get one of your red teamers to go and test this. It is a lot of fun. But other than that, thank you very much, and I will see you all at the pub later tonight.